Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting webinar ahead, but first I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session. If you have any questions, we do want you to send those in by using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. This is also where you're going to find the chat tab, and this is where we want you to engage with your fellow audience members. Let us know your thoughts or just tell us where you're from. And finally, before we conclude today's webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So our topic today is modern incident and change management. And I'm joined today by Bart Reese, Director of Business Solutions at Everbridge, and Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer here at Techstrong Group. Bart, Mike, thank you both so much for being here. Mike, I'm going to let you get us kicked off.
All right, great. Hey, thank you. Bart, now let's just get started here with parsing something, because while incident and change management, at least in my mind, are closely related, they're not always precisely one and the same thing. So from your perspective, what's wrong with incident management as we know it today? And then let's shift over to, what's wrong with change management as we know it today as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great place to start, Mike. Truly appreciate it. So the first thing, when we take a look at incident management, first and foremost, it tends to be a little bit reactive these days as opposed to proactive. And some of the reasons why that is the case is it is a very cross-functional effort that introduces quite a bit of silos in the process. So when you are looking at incident management, depending on the type of major incident, they do come from all different types, so to speak. You're going to have infrastructure teams involved, potentially development teams involved. Statistically, depending on which study you read, I always like to say, anywhere between 60 to some papers I've read, upwards of 75% of incidents are related to some sort of change, whether it be code or infrastructure. So naturally, change management is yet another one of the silos that sometimes exist within the overall incident management process. And those silos are process silos, team silos, as you have different ownership pieces within incident management. And then you have tool silos as well, because different areas of the organization have a preference of their purpose-built tools. And if all of this isn't connected, that's where you have a lot of those silos start emerging, which then adds to that reactive nature as opposed to proactively being able to bring all of those resources together.
Do you think that this whole working from home phenomenon for the last 2 years, and it looks like we're going to work from home maybe for at least another year or more, has really forced people to rethink all these issues and look at all this stuff and say, hey, even in the best of times, our incident management stuff wasn't probably anything to write home about. But now that half the workforce or more may be working from anywhere, do we need to rethink that whole approach? And is that driving people to think about that, or is that something we're overlooking?
I think it's definitely on the forefront, but sometimes we're not looking at this challenge broadly enough. So when I look at incident management, and to piggyback off the previous question of what's really wrong, some of the key ingredients to success are obviously communication, collaboration, as well as automation. And I'm happy to be discussing all three of those concepts. Now, working remotely, we have teams that traditionally used to be on site. We have, network operations teams that used to be working in a more intimate fashion in one centralized location. So naturally, the importance on communication and collaboration has become a lot more pronounced in our hybrid work environment these days. And it's leading a lot of organizations to start thinking about resiliency in a way, because if I'm now relying on a collaboration platform, that is now an extra risk element in my process, as that is another piece of technology that could be subject to an outage. So a lot of organizations are taking a step back and looking at multiple ways to really address this challenge of how do I make sure I can engage the right people at the right time when I need to, ideally in an automated fashion, when everyone is working remotely, being mindful of that potential bottleneck threat that they have from a technology perspective. So a lot of organizations are discussing resiliency and really having out-of-band communication mechanisms that they can respond to whatever Murphy's Law throws their way. So this is absolutely a big challenge, and a lot of people are thinking about it. I even argue that sometimes it's dominated the conversation with incident management, and some of the other aspects we'll get into sometimes don't get the same level of attention as they deserve, as everyone is always focused on collaboration, communication, and hopefully, we'll be discussing automation here in a bit as well.
Well, let's jump right into automation, because that seems to me, at least with incident management and to a certain degree change management as well, at the root cause of the issue. We have an incident and everybody stands around and says, what should we do? And maybe that all should be automated and we should know what we're going to do beforehand. I mean, what are the right level of automation and what should we be thinking about here?
Yeah, so back in the very beginning of our conversation here a moment ago, it all stems, in my opinion, from incident management and a lot of organizations being reactive. In a certain way, if we have an organization that's continuously reacting to an incident where the impact is already being experienced, either by end users, by customers, then we have failed in one regard already. And this is because there is a wall, not a physical wall, but a wall between development teams and IT operations. And that's where we really have the root cause of some of that reactionary behavior that we see, because there's a lot of early warning signs where there are events that are coming in from monitoring systems, whether it be to infrastructure teams or SREs and engineers. But because there is no automation between those areas and IT operations, organizations often get lost in the noise, and that event that could have been mitigated eventually escalates to a major incident. And we're really looking at where automation really plays a role. It's all about making information available everywhere in an automated fashion. Because like I mentioned, major incidents especially are very cross-functional. So if we're talking about an issue with a critical service that maybe stems from a recent release that has been pushed out, there's obviously SREs, engineers that are looking at signals that are coming in from various tools, but then to kick it over the wall to operations is usually a manual effort. So it's really important to establish these playbooks that all your key stakeholders are aware that they exist. So everyone knows what the high level process is. We need to make sure that we're extending the value of all the tools that we're using and proactively let all key stakeholders know of a potential issue and really understanding that impact. Today, very decentralized. We have development teams that maybe are experts on their service, but they don't always know the up and downstream dependencies as it relates to, a CMDB. Then you have IT operations folks that are always playing catch up in terms of what's being developed and pushed over from a support standpoint. And then you have infrastructure teams that are looking at their own tools, and the engagement is often very manual and reactive. It's once the impact is felt, once the alarm bells are ringing, then we have folks like a major incident manager that becomes scrambling and trying to get the full scope of the story, when in reality, there have been alarms ringing for quite a bit of time, but they often get lost in the noise and lost in disjointed processes.
All right, kind of sounds like we have a failure to communicate, to reference an old Paul Newman movie. But we have people, we have processes, and we have platforms. And this is an old story, right? We're supposed to bring all those things together in a meaningful way. So what is the challenge when it comes to incident management of pulling those things together, and how do we create something that looks like a modern incident management workflow? And then we'll get on to change management in the same way.
Yeah, and that's really directly is automation. Because there's decades worth of investment on various platforms that are purpose-built for their task, which I'm, by the way, not proposing that people consolidate to one platform, because there's a reason why all these tools exist if you're looking for best of breed. But it's really identifying the pain points or the friction between those various tools. There's often not a lot of automation between these various platforms that could actually accelerate process. And communication that is just purely contextual doesn't do too much to drive automation. Sure, it informs people. You could rally people onto a bridge maybe a little bit faster. But ideally, you also want the communications to be actionable, right? I could actually interact with them and that could trigger a process in yet another tool. One of the examples I always like to talk about is really looking at the role of someone like an SRE during a major service going down and causing a major incident. Ideally, if I'm being proactive in my process, I am armed and I know the service inside and out, and I have playbooks, I have automations that I could run to try to fix it. Now, if the impact is really severe because there is a lot of downstream and upstream dependencies that it needs to be a major incident, the reality is that a lot of organizations are then using corporate standard systems to manage that process. So that's when you have your big ITSM platforms. And as an SRE, I may not be an expert in those ITSM platforms because we use Jira or we use different tools that I use day to day. So that's that friction that could be alleviated. How about instead of having to pick up the phone and engage someone like a major incident manager and manually escalate this process, how about I could hit a button to try to remediate the issue? Only if that fails, then hit another button in the alert itself or in the tool that I'm using to then automate the creation of that ITSM ticket, automate that phone call that goes out to my major incident manager. So that's really the balancing act that needs to happen. Is we also don't live in a world with unlimited money, right? So you can't rip and replace every tool that's in the environment. So the name of the game is actually extending the value of what you have in place today. That frees up room for budget and modernization and other initiatives that you may have on the technology side, but making sure that I could add an automation between Jira and my ITSM or between my monitoring system and my ticketing platform or multiple platforms for that matter. That's really where real value creation happens. So that way you're not disrupting people from their desired user interface and from the tools that they're used to working day in, day out, but make sure that you're bringing it together, because having that decentralized model, if it's not all integrated, is actually causing pain. So how about when someone updates that Jira issue or the Remedy or ServiceNow issue, how come that doesn't automatically update all my Slack channels, all my Teams channels? How come that's not happening in real time without a human having to do that manually? And that's really that balancing act today. A lot of the times, organizations do have a playbook for major incident management. Major incident manager does spin up, a Teams channel or a Slack channel, but the problem is all that is manual. So you're adding quite a bit of toil and manual effort and stress on those operations teams when a lot of that really should be automated, so folks can really focus on continuously improving and continuously driving more and more automation as opposed to continuously firefighting.
It almost sounds like you're calling for an automation overlay that sits between all these different tools and platforms and kind of shares those alerts with the context required for somebody to take an action and maybe fix something without having to call, a fire alarm. But if they do need the fire alarm, they can call it. Is that kind of the process that we need to think about? And what does that overlay look like? Are there examples of that? Is that something I buy or build?
Yeah, ideally, that's a great question. There are tools out there, right? We are one of those systems as well, so very in tune with this particular topic. But my personal opinion is building all of this in-house, you have a substantial amount of risk to adding quite a bit of technical debt. Anything you try to build or put together on a platform that already has a lot of dependency on it, that's going to be pretty expensive from a maintenance perspective. So that's that illusion of, hey, am I really saving by doing this in-house, or am I adding technical debt and then adding a lot of maintenance when all these different systems are continuously changing? So ideally, this is something that a lot of organizations will actually purchase. And the reason behind it is to lower that technical debt and also be able to keep pace with change. Change really is the only constant. So when you're looking at evaluating some of these platforms, one of the things that I really urge is picking a platform that is able to keep up with that pace and build meaningful interactions between platforms without needing to sit down and write a bunch of code, because the more coding and development you have to do, as opposed to things that operate in more of a plug and play model, the more maintenance and risk you're going to have over time.
Yeah, and to your point, this doesn't add a lot of differentiated value to the business per se. It's something that they need to have, but it's not something that you would look at it and go to the shareholders and say, "Isn't it great that we have this thing?" Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I am monitoring the chat. I got engaged with the conversation, but a good question just came in that I would love to mention, and we'll definitely get to it later as well in terms of recommendations on AI and ML. I have the honest opinion that AI and machine learning are probably some of the most overused terms when we start discussing various topics. And when I'm talking about incident management, sure, AI and ML is absolutely useful to augment operations, but I also think that sometimes it is mislabeled. What a lot of organizations really need is situational intelligence. And sometimes people conflate that with AI, when it not necessarily is AI quite yet. But what is situational intelligence? That is comes in many flavors. Service intelligence, right? So I know, hey, this service is down. I know the downstream impact. I know the dependencies. I know the impact on the business, as I may need to engage business continuity teams as well. Then there's change intelligence, right? I have an issue with the service. All right, well, what are the recent changes? What are maybe issues in a different platform like Jira? Let's actually paint the full picture. And to me, a lot of organizations have to get there first before they could really harness the power of AI and machine learning. I'm sorry to jump in with that. I just saw the question pop in. And it is relevant to that whole conversation of having an intermediary platform that connects and extends the value of all of these systems is really important, because it's going to help downstream with reporting as well. And that is exactly, Mike, you nailed it when you kind of responded back with what I'm recommending, or what do I see a lot of organizations doing, is having a platform to really handle all of these events and major incidents, because communication, collaboration, automation from a cross-tool perspective, that is a pretty big ask. And if you use an existing tool in your infrastructure that maybe isn't purpose-built for that function, that's where you get, custom development and a pretty expensive solution that may not be delivering on the value that you really need.
To that end, and we've talked about it, in my mind, there's kind of really two major types of incidents that people routinely deal with. And the first one is directly related to change management. It seems to me there's half the time, I'm just making up a number, but at least half, the incident itself that you're trying to deal with is directly related to some change that was just made to the IT environment itself. You just don't know where it was and when it happened. So is this kind of where we need incident management and change management to converge? Because I need to be able to discover where exactly the latest changes were, because 90% of the time that may be where my issue lies.
Absolutely. And not only that, that information should be served to you. So if I'm an incident manager, and that's one of the that's one of the before and after images, right? In a lot of cases, there is a process, right? I engage, or even during a major incident, sometimes I need to do an emergency change, right? I need a config change, an emergency change. So I'm engaging change management, often in a frantic and manual fashion. But then you have the inverse that you described, is I have an incident and it's actually being caused by a change that already took place. While I receive the data on the incident, not to belabor the point, but that is an important piece of information. I should not just be getting a million of alerts from a million different platforms. I should be getting one alert that consolidates all the data. Hey, did this originate from a New Relic alert? Great, here's the details. Are there related incidents that could be potentially related based on the impacted business service or CI? Great. Here are the ticket numbers and the descriptions. Has there been any recent changes? Include that in the alert. Enrich that alert to provide more of that situational intelligence. And that seems minor, but if you really think about that at scale, that is a pretty big shift, and it's going to reduce a lot of manual effort, manual phone calls, manual bridges between incident managers and folks on the change management side. All information that's already there, it already exists. Unfortunately, often in a siloed manner, bringing that together has tremendous value to expedite that whole process.
Mm-hmm. And then going to cybersecurity, is that just another type of incident these days, and we should think about it in those terms, or is there something unique about cybersecurity incidents that we need to add to this conversation?
Yeah, that is a conversation in itself. But to put it quickly, cybersecurity incidents or security incidents, working with a lot of organizations, sometimes they converge and they actually follow, the P1 or P0 path of major incident management. But there's obviously a lot of stuff that happens beforehand from a monitoring perspective. Some organizations actually have dedicated SOCs for cybersecurity incidents when they do some of that more detailed analysis. But it eventually converges with incident management, because a security incident, it could cause services to go down. It could cause operational pain for the business. But where cybersecurity really gets a little bit different is the more obvious connection between the actual cyber threat and business continuity at large. And I always argued that even a major service disruption, you should have a bridge between business continuity, because organizations at large are increasingly reliant on digital services. Look no further than telemedicine in healthcare or e-commerce in retail. If you have a service go down, that does require cross-functional engagement, not only with technical folks, but with business continuity. So when you look at cybersecurity, I mean, if we're in a highly regulated vertical, like FinServ, for instance, you have regulatory obligations that now you have to pull in other people that sit outside of IT. So cybersecurity incidents are like major incidents, but more so due to their nature and the threat that they pose to all areas of the organization, including business continuity.
Yeah. We have a question here that goes to the heart of some of the issues that people run into. It says, basically, do you believe that code migration tools require an approval validation check to a change management system record to allow them to be deployed? And that sounds like a reasonable good practice, but in reality, it seems like we let developers deploy and program stuff to infrastructure all the time. So, should we put a gate there that says no, or is that a conversation we just can't culturally have?
Yeah, so I do believe that approvals and validation checks are absolutely important. Now, the reason why a lot of organizations don't necessarily have the best etiquette in that department is, once again, often lack of automation. And depending on, for code migrations, I would argue that yes, you should have validations and check. At the very least, you should have an audit. And that goes without saying in terms of all automation. Even a service restart, right? A service goes down, and maybe I'm the SRE. I know that due to the error, 80% of the time, I do the service restart and the issue goes away. Well, that's great for mitigating the impact, but that's not really great from a problem management perspective, right? We shouldn't have to be doing that. So that is something we have to address. Same concept goes to, doing any code migrations. At the bare minimum, I definitely argue that you definitely need an audit, a record of that happening, because you need that to feed not only incident management, but problem management. And there's obviously different criticality levels of the code that we're also talking about, right? What is a mission critical system? What is more ancillary? But at the bare minimum, I'd say audit is very important. In most cases, approval and validation is also something that is highly encouraged.
All right.
But it shouldn't be all manual.
Shouldn't that be all manual? I guess I don't want to leave this conversation because we're jumping back and forth on a couple of things, but we do have a question on cybersecurity, and since we're here, why not? And it asks, are we just too much focused on confidentiality versus integrity and availability? And is that part of our problems because we're not really following the full life cycle guidelines as defined by NIST? And to that point, are there a set of best practices that we should be following here somewhere along the line for incident management and change management?
Oof, that was a loaded question, Mike. Let me see this one in the chat. All righty. I'm going. All right, I'm going to take a stab at it and then guide me, Mike, or maybe the participant that asked the question. If I'm off course, then I'll definitely try to redirect. But from a cyber security perspective, when you're really looking at integrity and also availability from a risk perspective, right? Integrity meaning, I have confidential data that I definitely don't want to leak, but maybe the system is still up and running and it's not causing an availability risk. Both of those are very important in their own ways, right? Obviously, integrity and losing data, that really becomes one, DR processes get invoked in that particular swim lane. And also business continuity does as well, especially in highly regulated fields. That really becomes a business continuity concern as we're answering to a lot of regulators. Now, in terms of availability risk, that is also an area of making sure that organization is armed with intelligence, situational intelligence, service intelligence, so we actually understand the impact when we're dealing with a particular issue. And a lot of the times that also occurs in a silo. So maybe I have my cybersecurity team working through an issue and doing, discovery on that particular issue without necessarily being able to very easily draw the lines of the potential downstream impact on services and their availability. And that is where a lot of the slowdowns and pain points come into the process, where we really should be engaging all of those teams, especially making sure that we're giving the right amount of information, of course, depending on the nature of the cyber incident. You don't broadcast details to absolutely everybody. But understanding the downstream impact on those services, we need to make sure that we're getting those teams involved early to mitigate availability impacts, especially how important a lot of these services are to the foundational running of the business. So it can't all be in silos. We really need to have an understanding. And it all starts with planning, not to deviate too much. I know I've been bouncing around quite a bit, but when we're looking at planning, business continuity has plans. Major incident management has playbooks. They have plans. From a cybersecurity perspective, there are response plans and protocols. But the interesting thing when I engage with a lot of organizations, a lot of the times the leads in their respective areas aren't privy to their own plans cross-functionally, which I always find interesting because they're so interdependent. So business continuity leadership should be on the same page as cyber and major incident. All of this information should absolutely be shared at a high level, as they do intersect and depend on one another.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think that a lot of the focus to that question is on the cybersecurity event of the moment, and not enough is paid to the dependencies downstream to that particular thing that may be offline or attacked and what impact that may have, which brings us to our next question, which is, you talked about the virtual wall between dev and IT ops, and one of our attendees wants to know, should this all be part of our DevSecOps workflows, or for that matter, our DevOps workflows, which are all about ruthless automation? And, do we need to kind of make incident and change management part of DevSecOps, and it's all one big happy thing?
That is an excellent question, and kudos to the participant that I see DevSecOps. That's absolutely a term that's gaining quite a bit of momentum. And from how orchestration will help you arrive at seamless operations and auto remediation, I could probably give maybe an example of what good looks like in some organizations that have a high degree of automation. So where does DevOps really come into it? In that context, I was referring to just a major incident. So I'll run the wheel again with a potential security example. But let's say vulnerability management, right? I have a bunch of vulnerability tools that I likely use to scan for vulnerabilities, issues. So from a development perspective, if there's a vulnerability that's been introduced as part of a recent release, development has a very active role there. Now, from a DevSecOps perspective, let's say that vulnerability is now also a cyber threat. So not only do I have to do development mitigative actions, maybe perform a rollback to a later, to an earlier version, if it's also causing some performance issues, but then seamlessly engage cybersecurity as well, because now that vulnerability, even if it's not an active threat, it does need to, maybe it's not being actively exploited. It is a threat that needs to obviously have the loop closed on itself with the cyber folks. So how does automation and auto remediation really help? So I gave one example of what I like to call a mitigative action. And I encourage a lot of the organizations I speak to have mitigative actions in their communications. So the example I gave you, right? Hey, I have a service that's down, it's enriched. So let's go back to before I get an alert, the other issue is there's too many alerts, there's too many tools. So instead of getting all the information piecemeal, ideally, if I'm on the development side of the house as an SRE, I'm getting that alert and it's enriched with a lot of data to help me triage faster. I have the core alert details, great. Maybe go check my infrastructure queues like RabbitMQ to see what is the impact. Is this an isolated incident or is this actually causing other pain to the organization? Let's check my code base automatically. Has this service had any code committed to the code base recently? Maybe if it did, then I have a smoking gun right there. Why maybe now all of a sudden I'm getting this issue? Let's actually, maybe I'm using a pipeline automation tool like Jenkins. Let's maybe see if that code base was deployed into production. Wouldn't that be suspicious if, an hour before I started getting these alerts, there is new code that was actually pushed into production? Ideally, for some low-hanging fruit, like a restart of a particular service, maybe there's already some remediation that was attempted before I got called and woken up in the middle of the night and I'm, wiping the eye boogers out of my eyes. I actually see that, hey, Ansible Tower tried to restart the service and I have an error code that something is wrong with my service that's being impacted. Well, now let's actually click that button and engage major incident management automatically, right? Create that ITSM ticket, call that MIM that's on call, and do all the things I would do, that Slack channel, do that Teams channel, all in an automated fashion. Same concept could apply to DevSecOps use cases from various tools, like FireEye or anything else. If I get a vulnerability, let's try to maybe address it. Maybe do a rollback. Let's actually create a security incident proactively without having to know and navigate all of the various tools. That's where mitigative actions and being more actionable with your communications is really going to add a lot of value and embody that concept that I talked about in the beginning of extending the value of existing tools. This doesn't call for a rip and replace of entire platforms. It really calls for adding very tactical automations to be able to alleviate friction. And where DevOps comes in, I always like, I really love the quote from Patrick Dubois about just definition of DevOps. And the part that always speaks to me is DevOps is simply the removal of friction between silos and processes. All the rest is engineering. I love that quote because the organizations are often kind of stuck in the middle of DevOps because small teams are doing great and they're automating, but we still have that higher level of silos between other areas of the organization. So if we focus more on that piece, incident management improves, change management improves, virtually any other process is going to naturally improve, where you always focus on the friction introduced between silos, between a process, between a tool. That's how we continuously iterate and improve.
All right. And seems like we're striking a chord here, because there is a question about going back to what you were talking about with code. Who's responsible for the audits, and is this a development issue or a security issue, and who should be kind of leading the charge on the audits themselves?
Yeah, audits are obviously a very broad term, but they absolutely should be centralized to a degree as well. So we always have this concept that we love to discuss with our clients, and that's making data available everywhere, which is important, but also having one place where everything resides. So this is a very loaded question that's going to be very difficult to answer, probably in the level of detail that the participant wants, because it is very situational in terms of what tools and process we're using. But fundamentally, if we're talking about security incidents, I have a platform that manages my security incidents. Obviously, all related audit activity should be fed into that tool. Now, the difference that we have to understand that could include data that sits outside of that cybersecurity practice. Maybe it is a DevSecOps type incident where there is valuable development data that's being tracked in a completely different tool, like my code base or the Atlassian suite or some other suite that the development team may be using. And it needs to also feed back relevant data into my security incident management system. Now, the inverse is true as well. If I'm having a security incident, some cleaning data needs to be fed to other tools like major incident management tools, development tools. And that's where also having one centralized location, if you're leveraging a true incident response platform that doesn't just cover major incidents, but all sorts of events, whether they be development-related events, security-related events, there's a lot of value of also centralizing some of that data in a platform that is tool agnostic, right? That really can integrate with any system that you have in place. It's tool agnostic because tools come and go, they change. So if we really look at incident response as its own, it really is its own animal from that perspective. It's very useful to also have one dedicated place to have an audit, a timeline, so I know exactly what's happening in my ITSM, what's happening in my development tools, what's happening in maybe SOAR SIM platforms, to really give you that macro level audit. And that's really the last point I want to make to this question, is what you need in an audit is different based on the persona you're feeding that data to. There's obviously micro level events that maybe, the cybersecurity teams working in a SOAR SIM platform. That's where you really want those very granular details. And then if it turns into a business continuity issue and senior and executive leadership, you need to also be able to provide those macro level audit events as well to serve that audience. So I kind of prefaced before answering the question, kind of a difficult one. I tried to give a level of detail without getting too deep, because that could be a whole conversation. But hopefully that addresses some of that question in terms of audit, where data needs to be. To summarize, you need to be able to have data everywhere that's relevant, and having one location from a response perspective is going to be very useful as well to give you those metrics.
So we talked a lot about automation, and that's great, but do you think that people just don't practice their incident management response enough? And that, when the incident emerges, everybody runs around and looks for their online playbook and their handbook and says, this is what I'm supposed to do. And, they're flipping through pages trying to figure out, what the response is while Rome continues to burn. So do we need drills? Do we need more practice?
Absolutely. I think that's something that organizations are starting to realize, especially from the cyber perspective. It's becoming an increasing threat, and doing things like tabletop exercises is an example of more of that macro level activity, right? There's a lot more stakeholders that need to engage. But what I would like to, drills are great. Practicing response is excellent, but that is not the key point of the solution. It's important to practice so we operationally know how to use our tools, and there's no learning curve that someone needs to go through in the middle of a critical incident. But it definitely is a piece of the puzzle. So not going to go deep into this topic, but in addition to doing practice, it's important for organizations to really be able to identify their process, actually map it out. It's kind of funny. I talk to organizations and sometimes they can't provide me a centralized, all-encompassing process because it exists in silos, right? Hey, this piece is done by those folks. I'm not really sure what they do, but they do something. But as an organization, mapping out that process and identifying constraints, meaning, hey, this is an activity that is manual, maybe should be automated. Hey, this is an activity that has a considerable amount of wait time between this action and the next action because it is a cross-functional item and I'm manually engaging, the other team, whether it be change management or whether it be development community. And that is, in a nutshell, a value stream mapping exercise. So practicing and running exercises is great, but fundamentally reviewing your process, identifying those constraints, and focusing on alleviating those constraints is even a more meaningful process that needs to be iterative. And what that means is you never see what constraint is hiding behind the previous constraint until you alleviate that first, right? So that's why when you're evaluating constraints, you find a bottleneck, you fix it, and then that exposes you to be able to identify other ones downstream. And frankly, if you're fixing or rolling out a technology project or an initiative that isn't directly tied to constraints within a key process, then any improvement is really going to be an illusion. We're not actually resolving the root cause of the process. And exercising helps in that process, which is why I bring it up, right? Sometimes when you go through a tabletop exercise, it's important to debrief, evaluate, look for areas of improvement. So we're not only training people from an operational standpoint, how to use tools and make sure we can execute the playbook, but fundamentally reevaluate the playbook itself because things change pretty fast.
Just for those who don't know, you want to take a stab at defining value stream management? That may be a new term for a couple of folks. What is that exactly?
Yeah, so value stream management is usually begins, it's actually a process that began from the manufacturing industry in terms of reviewing a process. I think Toyota may have been one of the first ones to start doing it, and continuously iterating on it. So finding what they call, in that process, we usually define constraints. So what is something that is slowing down the overall process? And obviously, in this context of the conversation, we're not talking about things from a manufacturing perspective, but from an incident management perspective. And the reason why there's value in that name, it often begins with identifying your value streams. So this could be, just to give you an example, if I'm talking about incident management, it could be, hey, one of my value statements I want to begin with is reducing noise. My teams are getting bombarded with a lot of alerts from a lot of systems. I want to reduce that, or I want to improve my mean time to detect, or I want to improve my mean time to rally and respond to issues. So when you identify your value statements and then you evaluate your process, you're finding constraints that are preventing you from being able to realize that value. So what's actually slowing down your mean time to detect? What's slowing down my mean time to rally? On calls all over the place and people struggle with finding who is on call and the data is not accurate. So value stream mapping is really identifying all of those constraints, and then it's a loop. So it goes well with concepts of agile as well, because once you alleviate a constraint, you could usually then find other constraints further down that process, and you want to continuously be reevaluating. So in a nutshell, that really is the whole concept of value stream management. So just identifying and alleviating bottlenecks or slowdowns within any process. It was born in manufacturing, but could be applied to any process.
Why don't we learn from our previous incidents? It seems like a lot of organizations, they're encountering the same incidents over and over again. Frequently, the people who were involved in an incident a year ago are no longer at the company. There seems to be a lot of things that go on. So is there some way to think about learning from an incident and capturing that as like knowledge versus everything being a unique fire drill?
Absolutely. So great question. And at the risk of sounding very redundant, silos, again, is going to be a really big factor with this answer. Silos is really a top-bottom problem, not only from identifying incidents, resolving them, but also learning from them, right? And if data is being kind of decentralized and we're not really truly understanding the full picture of an incident, meaning what caused it, how did we resolve it, what after actions are we going to do to prevent this from happening again, that's usually where we get lost. There's too much, and there's a lot of reasons for this, right? One, there's too much noise. A lot of organizations actually struggle with prioritizing incidents correctly. So when I look at incident response, one of the first symptoms I look for is, hey, what are your escalation percentages? What are your de-escalation percentages, right? So how many incidents, how many false positives do you have, right? Where, hey, someone declared a major incident, turns out to be a P3 at best. Or, hey, I do have some rudimentary integration with a monitoring tool that just, creates my tickets in my ITSM, but they just apply, the same severity, right? So then I still have to triage and really determine, is this a major incident? Is it not? So there's a lot of noise that we need to sift through. And it all goes back to that concept I talked about before of situational intelligence. And that has so many concepts to it. From an incident management perspective, look no further than the CMDB, right? So many organizations struggle because change is the only constant to have a clean CMDB with actual downstream dependencies all mapped out. I always like to think of it as Bigfoot. We all know what it's supposed to look like. Spotting one in the wild is a lot more difficult. So monitoring systems producing too much noise, hard to filter. CMDB maybe not being in an optimal state, so it's very difficult to truly understand what this service issue means to the overall business service, a business function. And then we also have change intelligence. Because so many issues are caused by change, how do I quickly correlate, hey, based on this service, show me a quick list of recent changes. And let's actually link to those records so I can quickly see the data instead of manually hunting that down. So if we don't have good intelligence, then we're not going to be able to then have those consolidated incident reports, which is that other third pain point, is because some things are happening in different tools. Maybe this major incident was actually caused by a defect that was introduced in a release. So now there's all these JIRA issues being created and developers are having these sidebar chats. But then in my ITSM platform, maybe I have no visibility of that, which is, by the way, a pain for an incident manager to have to constantly be, asking for some of these questions and insights when they're doing, their reporting. It'd be nice if that data was just somewhere that could be easily accessed. So you have some data in one platform, some data in the ticketing system. You have some key data and maybe monitoring solutions. So not having a consolidated timeline across your platforms is also painful. And a lot of major incident managers will not only dread the fear of being woken up in the middle of the night for a major incident, but actually dread having to spend a lot of time and effort building a post-incident report, because that means extracting data from cross-functional teams and manually logging it, putting it on a chronological timeline. All of that could and should be automated, and then that will give us the insights and the power to take advantage of critical thinking and take advantage of continuous learning in our incident response process, right? Hey, how do we fix the issue? Well, this is what we did. Do we think we could have done that automatically? Is there an automation that maybe we could include next time so that way we could avoid the impact? Or is there a config change that's now needed as an after action so we could make sure that, hey, we did a short-term fix to stop the bleeding, but now are we actually tracking and feeding problem management and feeding those after action reports and keeping track of them so we can continuously learn and improve? I'm going to probably apologize a few more times, Mike, for the very long answers, so I'll take a pause.
No worries.
Yeah.
I think most of our attendees seem to be in violent agreement with the notion that we need root cause analysis. And yet, in my experience at least, change management is hard. What happens is so let's say we do the root cause analysis and we get the results of that, and then we want to make the changes that are required, and we put the changes. You can almost set your watch by somebody starts to revert the process back to what they previously knew, and making the change stick is hard. So how do you kind of make the change stick after all this incident review is done?
Yeah. So it's much easier to make a change stick if it actually is alleviating manual effort, manual steps, and simplifying the complexity. So that is a core element is to make things stick. You really do want to rely on more automation because frankly, over time, as we deploy more and more automation, that does naturally have the effect of shifting culture as well. The other answer to that question is a cultural change, right? If we actually change culture and collaborate more cross-functionally on a regular basis, then that's obviously another way to make these changes stick. But what I've actually seen is start small. A lot of organizations are in a different journey on the maturity index, so to speak, in terms of where their incident response process is versus where they want to go. It's not binary, right? There's steps in the middle. So I'm all about incremental change, incremental improvement. Ideally, the more automation you add over time, that also trickles down to fundamental cultural shifts. At the end of the day, it's an effort to make everyone's life easier, not more difficult. So as long as we identify the appropriate increments, focus on the most impactful changes first to get buy-in, and then have that be an iterative process. As an example, I work with a lot of incident management teams, and it's so funny how sometimes the very small thing could be perceived as a big win. Whether that be, I worked with one incident manager in the past where their biggest pain point was the organization used more than one collaboration platform, right? The developers, I think, use Slack, the business like Teams. So this individual had a very real but simple pain point to fix of just automating the creation and the continual posting of data to all these various collaboration channels they need. Simply automating that one step actually caused a high degree of change. And then we're able to tackle the next challenge and the next challenge. So making things stick isn't all about changing the world overnight, but really an iterative process focusing on the most impactful pain points.
All right. We also have a question that goes back to some of what you were talking about with automation, but in the absence of full automation, do you have any advice for how to add service intelligence, situational intelligence to the proverbial value chain? I mean, can I put some empathy in the system by buying people pizza, or what do I got to do here?
Yeah, so automation is also one of those terms. I always get a little chill that goes down my spine when I do hear, AI and ML as well. But automation, this is where I think I mentioned this concept before. Even though behind the scenes you technically have some automation that can do this data for you, but it's also important to have signal intelligence. So signal intelligence, in my mind, is almost a precursor or it eventually feeds service intelligence to eliminate the noise. And if I'm getting events from monitoring systems, and if I'm talking more from a DevOps angle in terms of my value chain, there's tools that I will use day to day. So instead of making me manually, go check, hey, I have an event that's coming in from App Dynamics, right? And now I have to go randomly check, what's going on from infrastructure perspective in RabbitMQ. Let's check what happened in the code base of that service. Before we get down to service intelligence and dependencies, I think it's important to be able to reduce incoming traffic and correlate relevant data together. There's many ways to do that. Obviously, we have a platform that does it. There's platforms like, a monitor of monitors, right, where you actually have the consolidation of events, which I think is actually a big important precursor to then go into, other automation-driven initiatives. But first, you have to make things converge and have signals actually feeding a centralized place, which will then give me the opportunity to make automation more attainable and a more attainable task, right? If data is actually in one spot, it makes it a lot easier for me to automate as opposed to herding cats, so to speak, in terms of everything's too decentralized and not feeding one centralized mechanism.
Are there KPIs that people should be tracking specifically, or is that individual to each company?
So when we get into KPIs, I think that is, if we're going to stay on the topic of, incident management per se, I think there is going to be some pretty big deviation and specific to, the organization that we're talking about. Obviously, some organizations don't develop much in-house, right? They use vendors. Some organizations like a, tech company are actually developing product in-house. So that's really going to change the conversation from a KPI standpoint. But ideally, we definitely want to be able to be more precise. So you want to reduce noise. You want to reduce false positives, ideally. In my opinion, some major incidents, of course, they're unavoidable. Sometimes there's vendor lock-in. Sometimes there's, infrastructure challenges. But what organizations should really aim to do is making sure that we're proactive with mitigating the impact. So when I look at the number of major incidents experienced by an organization, if that number is high, there's obviously something very wrong in that picture, because not every incident, not every event, in my opinion, not every event should even be an incident. And obviously not every incident should be a major incident if we're adopting more of that proactive mindset.
All right. And your scores will improve as the fewer things that you call incidents, right? So there's
absolutely.
All right. Last question, and we need a short answer.
Good luck.
We have ITSM platforms everywhere, and we have DevOps platforms and dev tools, and you mentioned a lot of different things. Will those things ultimately send signals and APIs themselves, and they'll be more naturally integrated over time, or do you think that they're always going to be isolated and we need to stitch them together?
Yeah, I really do believe that there's always going to be multiple tools that are purpose-built for their function if you truly want the best of breed solutions out there. And if you look at technology, there's a lot. There's monitoring systems. Even if you look at the cyberspace, there's a lot of tools, right? There's SOAR, SIM, endpoint detection tools. From a development perspective, I know the question, I think, focused on ITSM. Sure, there is, I think in the question I saw Jira Service Desk mentioned, but there's other development tools as well, right? Pipeline automation tools, monitoring systems that are very service-centric. And the reality is that if you try to have one tool address all of the needs, you're probably not going to get the best experience. You're kind of going to get one of those, hey, jack of all trades, but master of none scenarios. I think there's always going to be multiple tools out there that we really will need to integrate together. And when you look at a platform, I saw ServiceNow was mentioned. Obviously, they're a very powerful platform, excellent platform. But when you really look at the concept of incident response, I would just caution organizations there's a lot of dependencies there, right? That is a massive platform with a lot of implications. And as the platform changes, that poses a little bit of a risk of adding dependency to fundamental response that could also be very relevant to issues outside of that platform.
All right, Bart, we got to jump here.
Yep. Excellent.
Hey, guys, thank you for your time. And Bart, sharing your knowledge was awesome. I'm going to hand it back to Cody, who's going to give us some closing comments and who won what.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you so much, Bart, for joining us today. I'd like to quickly remind everyone that this session was recorded. So following this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access this webinar on demand. You can also find the recording living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. So to those 4 $25 Amazon gift card winners, they are Krishna D, James D, Max F, and Jody R. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't see your email, please check your spam folder. So Mike, Bart, thank you. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. We'd like to ask you for just one more moment of your time to quickly fill out a post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we do hope to see you on an upcoming Techstrong Learning webinar or workshop. Everyone, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
You guys.